Okay, so could the United States in 2026 actually suffer the exact same fate as the ancient Roman Empire? Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a truly fascinating predictive model that draws a direct mechanical parallel between historical imperial collapse and a projected future macroeconomic crisis. Let's look at how the source material anticipates state failure based strictly on historical precedent, essentially mapping ancient systemic breakdown onto a modern timeline. We'll unpack this analytical framework step by step today. We'll start with the core theory of a modern Roman crisis, examine what they call the coercion feedback loop, analyze the balkanization trigger, explore the psychology of anosognosia in leadership, and finally, look at the projected dissolution of federal supremacy. All right, let's jump right into part one, a modern Roman crisis and its historical parallels for 2026. Now, the source material grounds its entire 2026 projection in the crisis of the 3rd century from ancient Rome, and it builds its whole theory around this concept called the dominance execution loop. So what does that actually mean in plain English? Well, imagine a system completely out of slack, like resources are just physically exhausted. But instead of adapting, the executive leadership rigidly decides to use pure, violent coercion to keep their dominance. It's basically a brute force response to a material, physical problem. The model doesn't just stick to Rome, though. It also points to the zero-margin sans-culottes, the striking labor classes of revolutionary France, and it even looks at the late Soviet Union when analyzing state-level nullification. But make no mistake here, the overarching dynamic the authors are highlighting, where macroeconomic collapse is met with this executive dominance loop, is fundamentally Roman. Moving on to Section 2, the coercion feedback loop, or crackdowns over management. This part brilliantly illustrates a sort of fatal domino effect. Picture ancient Rome for a second. Currency debasement makes basic everyday goods totally unaffordable, so naturally, the working class starts to protest. But here's the critical pivot in the model. The leadership? They don't see an economic crisis that needs managing. Nope. They see a direct threat to their absolute dominance. And their solution is brutal military crackdowns. And the analysis maps this ancient Roman response directly onto a projected scenario for 2026. It actually predicts that instead of sitting down and negotiating these economic grievances, a modern administration would deploy active-duty military or federalized National Guard to crush labor strikes and what they call no king's protests. It's literally ancient imperial force being applied to a modern executive playbook. Which brings us to Section 3, the balkanization trigger and the fracture of society. According to the source, this military crackdown is the fatal catalyst. It's the exact moment that breaks the system. Back in Rome, when the state couldn't provide basic bread giveaways anymore, the population just stopped cooperating. The model maps this directly to a 2026 legal balkanization. Basically, society fractures because local leaders start prioritizing their own community's survival over federal compliance, effectively breaking the nation into isolated, self-sufficient survival nodes. In both historical Rome and this projected 2026 scenario, local survival completely overrides federal loyalty. Ancient municipalities stopped sending tax revenues to the capital and just ignored imperial directives. Fast forward to 2026, well, the projection sees state governors and mayors legally nullifying presidential emergencies and totally ignoring federal mandates. The takeaway here is that when central authority can't provide basic stability, compliance just evaporates. Let's dive into Section 4, anosognosia and plenary authority, focusing on disconnected decrees. This brings us to a really fascinating psychological element of leadership during a crisis. The source material uses this clinical term, anosognosia. Actually, scratch that. It basically just means being totally blind to reality. In this state of mind, an executive tries to solve physical shortages, what the model calls exhausted structural slack, purely through the brute force of authority and blunt decrees. The parallels the authors draw here are pretty striking. Roman leadership operated under this exact same delusion, right? They issued imperial decrees to try and magically fix physical shortages of goods. The model argues this is identical to a projected 2026 president using the National Emergencies Act, attempting to artificially mandate economic order purely through paperwork. Because, think about it, a sweeping executive order completely ignores physical reality. Look at the projections in the document, a $7 per gallon fuel shortage, or a physical Chinese rare earth blockade. You simply cannot executive order a barrel of oil into existence. And income paper won't make rare earth minerals magically appear if the physical supply chains are broken. This massive disconnect between the stroke of a pen and the reality on the ground is pinpointed as the key driver of collapse. And that brings us to our final part, Section 5, Dissolution of Federal Supremacy and the Collapse of Authority. So, what is the model's ultimate conclusion? The text outlines what it calls the Chapter 11 tactic. This is where an executive, refusing to back down, aggressively attacks and effectively bankrupts established institutions just to consolidate power. But the model concludes that this aggressive consolidation is the absolute exact coercion trigger that fractured Rome, pushing the entire system way past its breaking point. It all leads to this really fatal paradox. On one hand, you have an executive forcefully demanding dominance. But on the other hand, you have a populace pushed entirely to the brink, fighting literally just for basic caloric and financial survival. By trying to forcefully dominate a starving or economically ruined public, the executive ironically guarantees the end of its own power, resulting in the total dissolution of federal supremacy. This framework presents a pretty chilling, mechanistic view of how states fail when resources dry up. As we look at these historical echoes laid out in the explainer, it leaves us with one profound question about the ultimate limits of power. Can any executive actually mandate order against physical exhaustion? Or does relying on force when the system is starved always, inevitably, guarantee the fracture of the state?